People in the queue are getting their lunch. I'm going to make a start. Welcome everybody to this Conservative Environment Network event. My name's Mercy Muroki and I work on climate and energy policy here at SEN. For those of you who don't know, SEN is an independent forum for Conservatives here in the UK and abroad as well, who are in support of net zero nature restoration and resource security. The question we're going to try to unpick and answer today is net zero an electoral liability or an asset for the Conservative Party? And we're delighted that RenewableUK has sponsored this event, so we'd like to give them a big thank you. RenewableUK support hundreds of members, including business leaders, tech innovators and experts across industry to ensure renewable electricity is deployed across the UK and that their members have access to global markets. And from RenewableUK is Dan McGrail. Thank you for joining us, Dan. He is CEO, Chief Executive of RenewableUK, previously worked as CEO of Siemens Engines, and a variety of other roles across the energy industry. We also have, to my right, Graham Stuart, who's the MP for Beverley and Holderness, and he was previously the Energy Minister from 2022 to 2024, and has also served as Minister for Europe, and was the chair of the Education Select Committee, and he is a member of SEN's Parliamentary Caucus. Also pleased to be joined by Lord McInnes. He's a life peer and the Senior Insights Advisor at global consultancy Stonehaven, and he was the director of the Conservative Party for many years and a special advisor as well to Boris Johnson. And we're also joined by Selaine Saxby. She's a natural capital marketplace manager at the Devon Biosphere and a former MP for North Devon. While she was in Parliament, she was an active member of the SEN Parliamentary Caucus and was co-chair of the APPG on walking and cycling. Finally, last but not least, Nick Partington, all the way at the end over there. He's the senior manager at CT Group, a political consultancy, and he was an associate director at Stack Data Strategy and an analyst at Hanbury Strategy and at law firm VAR Dags. Have I said that correctly? We'll go with that. Thank you, panel, for joining us. So the question we're answering, as I said, is whether net zero is a liability or an asset for the Conservatives, particularly electorally. Under the Conservatives, since sort of 2010, the country has seen huge progress in terms of environment and climate, much of it a result of policies the Conservative government put in place. You all know we were the first major economy to sign net zero into law. We were also the first economy to halve our emissions against the 1990 baseline, and this was done whilst growing the economy during this period by 79%. And the Conservatives also established bodies such as the UK Infrastructure Bank and contracts for different schemes which have leveraged billions in private investment in renewable technology. And we are now home to, during that period, we became home to the largest offshore wind farms in the world. Now, obviously, the Conservatives did not get the result they were hoping for in this election. And, of course, they lost lots of votes to the Reform Party, who are actually anti-net zero. That was one of their policies. They were explicitly an anti-net zero policy, and their policy was to ditch that target. Polling has been done which showed that only 4% of Reform voters were voting because of Reform's policy on net zero, and of course immigration was really the main concern for people voting for Reform. During the end of sort of Rishi Sunak's time as Prime Minister at the end of 2023, he rode back on some of the party's climate commitments. So there was perhaps an electoral strategy there, trying perhaps to win back voters, which didn't materialise. We know net zero is a very divisive thing within the Conservative Party for many reasons. So the question really is whether a strong environmental platform will be enough to win back voters, or actually it will alienate voters that we need to win back. So that's the background to the debate. The format will be, each speaker will be given 3 minutes to make some opening remarks, and then we'll go out to audience questions. I may come back to some of the speakers with some additional questions as well. So if we can we start with yourself, Graham? Is that fine?
Oh, right. Excellent. Well, hello, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Typical politician, I want to twist the question immediately and say it's not the right question. The first question is net zero the right thing to do? And for that, the science is, I think, increasingly unequivocal. I've always got plenty of time to debate it with people. I think many of the concerns expressed by those who are sceptical of it, or the means by which we're doing it, are entirely valid, and we should enter into that conversation. But do we need, as a species, to deliver net zero? The answer is yes. Next thing you go is what when you talk about electoral advantage, what's the priority in politics? Well, it often seems like the priority is to make sure you win, which of course it always is. But I always think the hardest thing to do in politics is work out what the right thing to do is. That's what you need to sweat the hardest. What is the right thing to do? Not find out what's the most popular and then adopt that. Find out what the right thing to do is. And I started with that with number 1. So number 2 is I think it is the right thing to do. So in a sense, the way I'd want to twist the question would be to say, how do we make, if we agree, and we may not, and that's good to have the conversation, if we agree that net zero is the right thing to do for us as a species and for the UK to play its part, hopefully in 5 years or less under Conservative leadership, how do we go about doing that in a way which helps us win the election? So that's the way I would twist it round. We have, as Mercy have said, we totally led the world. I mean, we were the first major economy to halve our emissions. We led the global conversation with COP26. We transformed the economics of offshore wind. We have the largest tidal power. Practically none of this is known to the electorate. So somehow we managed, not even before the then Prime Minister's speech in September 2023, on the day that I arrived in New York for Climate Week, as I recall, that even before then we had somehow not managed to, given that we were doing it, to champion the fact that we were doing it and get people to know it. So just quickly from YouGov, 3 or 4 people out of 10 over the last few years saw the UK as doing more than other countries to tackle climate change. And YouGov's trackers showed that 50% of the population consistently said we weren't spending enough on reducing emissions. And given our record, the fact that we didn't convert that in among the people who care about this as an issue, as a salient issue, to own it and show what we'd done was problematic. But will net zero help us or hinder us in regaining power? That's something I'm interested to hear from you, because clearly there are costs. And there's a significant number of people who are concerned about those costs. And we now have a government which has made, in my view, some correct early moves, like getting rid of the effective moratorium on onshore wind. It was always mad to do that. And we've got onshore wind back. But it seems to want to take an approach to developing the infrastructure which is sticking its fingers in its ears and screaming, I'm not listening. And railroading everyone. If you do that from pylons to solar to other energy infrastructure, you're going to get a massive backlash. And we inevitably, in opposition, are going to be championing that and using that for a great deal of local electoral advantage. So one of the big challenges for us is how do we stand up to Labour for not listening, for not working with communities, and yet not turn ourselves into the NIMBY party, which not only appears but actually is effectively opposed to the steps we need to take to deliver net zero. So I have more questions than answers, despite my attempted effort to twist the question and tell Mercy what I thought it should be.
Thank you for that, Selaine. Let's go to you.
Thank you. And I just need to clarify, I'm talking as myself, not in my new position, which is apolitical. So what should have been an electoral asset and net zero, in my mind, did become a comms catastrophe for many of us on the doorstep. So I was asked specifically to focus on rural communities in the southwest and how we might take back seats like mine from the Lib Dems moving forward. So I asked my association WhatsApp group what they thought about net zero. So I got an instant response that it made the Conservatives a laughing stock. I then had one of my councillors produce some graphs and suggest that actually the world was cooling down. So thank you to Kitty for providing me with some super responses and rebuttals, which then privately one of my young Conservatives messaged me and said, thank you for doing that. I was very upset by what was said on the main group. And I think we do have an intergenerational issue around some of these conversations and our approaches to them. And it is something that really does matter to the younger generation. But one of my slightly perhaps more pragmatic members did point out that the UK was a small part of the problem. And I had the pleasure of meeting with John Kerry up at Westminster while I was still an MP and hearing his view. And yes, we did lead the world internationally, but our emissions are only a small part of that. And so one of the other things that I used to do in a former life was I was a maths teacher. And I think for me, where some of the net zero conversation has gone badly wrong is it's mathematically flawed. So yes, as a world, we do need to get to net zero. But where we've got individual businesses and individual sectors getting to net zero at different points in time, we're not necessarily getting some joined up strategy. As we've just seen with Tata stopping steel production at a time when we'd like to build 250 floating offshore wind turbines going off the Welsh coast. Some of those decisions are difficult, I think, for people to understand. Added into that, we don't always fully calculate for net zero. So we will now have to pay to ship in our turbines because we can't make them here. But shipping is actually the sixth, if it was a nation, the sixth biggest nation of emissions in the world. And we're not actually tackling that as a world. So we actually miss out some of the calculations when we're calculating net zero. And we see some utterly remarkable net zero calculations coming through in terms of greenwashing, carbon offsetting. The whole point of offsetting was it was for industries that really couldn't reduce their emissions any further. Yet what we're actually seeing is that people are using it as a way to avoid reducing their emissions. And so I think the language needs to change, and I think we need to think much more globally about getting to net zero. And some of these small targets internally, we need to join up our thinking so that we can actually deliver what the world needs, rather than just worrying about whether we've actually bought a couple of extra trees to offset this particular programme here, because we can't be bothered to put in any electric charging points and help people get over their cars. So I think that there's much to commend, but I do think our comms led us down very badly in terms of what we'd actually delivered in our time in office.
Thank you, Selaine. Let's go to Lord McInnes.
Thank you very much, Macy. And I just wanted to focus on what the voters think. We've carried out a lot of research into the 2019 Conservative Coalition to find out their views on climate and how they feel it affected the election. And I think the first headline is that climate and net zero was not a big factor in determining votes at the general election. Most people who switched from us wanted to punish the Conservatives and remove us from government. We all know that. And actually, climate and net zero wasn't a significant part in that. So neither the changes in our position around cars and climate emissions, nor people concerned about us going too far on climate. And we've done a lot of analysis on both those who stayed with us and those who switched. And what's really interesting is that about 40% of those who switched from us say that climate should be a priority for the Conservatives and are prepared to pay more if it helps us to reach net zero. And that's quite surprising. And what's especially surprising is that 20% of those people actually voted reform. So, as Macy has already said, a lot of people voted reform not because of climate, but because of immigration, other issues, an easy option for Conservatives to go to. And we shouldn't confuse the issues and assume that if we take a much harder line in climate, that will easily allow lots of reform voters to return. In fact, there might be an opportunity to get voters back from reform if we can demonstrate that we actually share their views on climate and net zero. I think, though, what's very important, and the caveat and nuances everything, is that Conservatives who support net zero and climate action do so on a pragmatic basis. They do so less Greta Thunberg, more Simon Clarke, and we've got to remember that Conservatives will support action on climate. They are concerned about net zero, but they are also concerned about the how, as to how that's going to be achieved. And going to Graham's point, that means that as Conservatives, we need to get in a position where there is an acceptance that we agree with people that climate must be dealt with, but we need to have nuance and understanding as to the measures that need to be taken to achieve that. And I suppose finally, if I were a leadership candidate, it's very important when appealing to this electorate of the members not to follow a burnt earth policy of saying we're against climate and net zero policy, because on day one of being leader, that same leader will then have to think about the voters who do care about climate and net zero and who we need to get back. Thank you.
Thank you. And with 5 seconds to spare, I can see there on your phone, on your timer. Nick, to you.
Fabulous. Yeah, thanks, Mercy. And just like Lord McInnes, I'm going to be talking about what the voters think, which, on reflection, is probably not the nicest topic to talk about for Conservatives in the room. So we've been lucky enough to do some work with SEN and RenewableUK, trying to get at this exact question, what's the place of net zero and rebuilding the coalition? So Lord McInnes has sort of spoken about what the election looked like and the fact that it perhaps wasn't a massive part of why the Conservatives lost 23% of their 2019 vote to Reform and about 14% to Labour and the Lib Dems, as well as 10% who stayed at home. Rebuilding that coalition is going to be quite difficult. There are two big challenges, I think, to my mind, that we kind of need to solve, which the first of which is that these Reform voters, many of whom we have assumed will just come back to the Conservatives when it comes to it, are pretty stubborn. 55% of them say that they're very unlikely to change their vote for the next election. That's quite remarkable. Whether that's a stickiness to do with the leader or whether it's a rejection of what the Conservatives have done on immigration, that's to be seen. But it's important to kind of have a really clear sense of that. The second is that those who've switched to Labour and the Liberal Democrats are actually pretty enthusiastic about Labour and the Liberal Democrats. They don't like the Tories. They're quite keen on Ed Davey and Keir Starmer, and they're relatively optimistic about this government, which is definitely not the case for the nation as a whole. So thinking about these challenges and trying to rebuild a coalition for 2024 or whenever it might be, there are some areas of net zero which actually do command quite a lot of consensus. So it's actually quite clear when you go into a room of people, whether they voted Reform, Labour, the Lib Dems or the Conservatives, that they know that we're going to have to get loads of power from renewables. This is really, really important. And whether they think it's going to be nukes, as every old bloke who voted Reform in every focus group I've ever been to tells me, whether it's nukes or onshore, offshore wind, solar, everyone is kind of clear that this is one of the big challenges of our age, kind of independent of whether it's global catastrophic climate change. This is really, really important. And what our polling showed is that all of these switcher groups that were going to have to see the Conservatives win back to do a good job of maintaining a coalition, they all want the Conservatives not to go back to old school sort of conservative principles and just think about those kind of retro, perhaps, issues that the Conservatives are known for, but also to address the challenges of our day and to have a platform which doesn't speak powerfully to the idea that we're going to have to shift away from hydrocarbons is going to make the Conservatives seem marginal. So to my mind, it's essential that we do address it and that is part of any platform that the Conservatives have. And again, to echo Lord McInnes, something that came out really strongly in some focus groups that we did in Teesside, obviously a bit of a bastion of net zero conservatism, is this idea that it has to be pragmatic. It has to not tread too harshly on ordinary people. The Labour Party moving forward the deadline for electric vehicle adoption is something that people had picked up on, and people thought, this is going to be costly to me. So how the design of the policy and the messaging of the policy is set out by the Conservatives is going to be vital as to how to carry people along with something that they broadly think is a good idea, while not spooking them, alienating them, and making them feel like you're on the wrong side. But opportunities there.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, let's go to you, Dan.
Thank you, Mercy. Lots of agreements on the panel and different nuances, but from our perspective, we think the Conservative Party have got a really good story to tell on renewables and on energy transition, and we're happy to say that anywhere to anyone. It is actually quite a significant accomplishment. We've seen about £52 billion of investment in offshore wind in the UK in the last 8 years alone. We've seen renewables overtake gas as the biggest source of electricity on the system. It may come as a surprise to some that as of 4:30 today, we will no longer have any coal-fired power stations on our system. And that was all enacted under policy implemented under Conservative government. That is quite a remarkable transformation. And this morning when I left to come here, 49% of our electricity was coming from wind power, which is pretty staggering, right? So really transformational story over the last period of government. Looking forward, and I think part of the job of this panel is to sort of future gaze a little bit into what might be happening in 2029. And if we consider what the current government is, I've got four key messages here. First of all, regardless of how far Labour go in terms of achieving their mission to reduce electricity bills, there will be certainly less volatility in people's electricity bills in 2029 than there is today. And that is, a lot of that is to do with the system of auctions and the contracts for difference regime which were implemented under the Conservatives, which is, you know, a very, very effective way of stabilising electricity prices. And it's also been a very effective way of reducing electricity prices because that's brought bills down by the cost of renewables down by 75%, which is pretty staggering. And even though we've seen a recent uptick as a result of recent inflation, it's still excellent cost, lower cost than nuclear, lower cost than unabated gas. And I know we get challenged on this point regularly. So there's a piece of analysis recently done by Aurora, independent energy market analysts, who've modelled various different scenarios for how the power system could evolve. And in all cases, the one that is the lowest cost for consumers is one which is dominated by renewables and led by offshore wind. So that is very clear. And actually the highest cost one is the one where we abandon net zero and run lots of unabated gas. The next point is that by 2029, some of the scaremongering that we've got used to about the electricity, about a renewables-led system will have been debunked. So we will have, got to 2029 with lots more renewables on the system, and we won't have had blackouts. We'll have found that our balancing systems and our mechanisms work to protect that. We won't be piles of dead birds. In fact, actually, the environmental restoration work that we did together with the Conservative government building the Marine Recovery Fund will see the renewables industry pile millions and millions of pounds worth of investment into nature restoration. So we should be proud of that and also shouting about it. By 2029, there'll be lots more people employed in the sector. We employ about 50,000 people between on and offshore wind today. So by the end of the decade, if the current government's aspirations are met or somewhat close to met, then that'll be closer to 120,000 people. So this will be a lot of people in constituencies, the likes of Aberdeen, Grimsby, Humberside, Teesside, which have had, up until recently, Conservative MPs. And finally, actually, the polling and all the polling that we've looked at, even if we don't reach the targets that have been very stretching targets that have been set under the current government, actually what people want to see is ambition and speed of action on this. When we look at the polling, people want to see high levels of aspiration. It was great to hear Graham talking there about actually the need to shout about this and actually talk about the aspiration and the ambition. And that desire for pragmatism is very clear. Actually, it comes across really strongly. And I think that pragmatism is the big question as we get to 2029 as to how the public feel, given the extent to which planning local communities and bringing local communities with us is going to be a critical element of the success. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Before I go to audience questions, I'm just going to ask a couple of follow-up questions. Firstly, for you, Graham, as our sitting MP, obviously it's hard to ignore the fact There's a leadership election on at the moment, and obviously the leaders are thinking about how they're going to position themselves if they're to be elected on net zero. What's the mood of the party at the moment in terms of MPs and leadership candidates, you think, on how they're going to position themselves and sell themselves to the electorate on issues of climate?
Well, the honest answer is it doesn't feel particularly a good position for us to be in on that at the moment. But we'll wait and see. And as was said by Nick, I think it's important that whatever the electorate today, that our future leaders consider the wider electorate in the future and also look ahead, as Dan also said, to an energy system which has delivered to date, will continue to deliver, and which independent consultants like Aurora suggest that harnessing, albeit how you do it, is very important. Harnessing clean energy as cheaply as possible for the UK will give us energy security, more stable pricing, and be good for the long term. And the last thing we want to be doing, and we want our leaders doing, is letting the Labour Party own that when we, in fact, are the architects of it. We've set out the whole journey. We've gone from less than 7% of electricity, and if there's one fact to take away and always throw in people's faces, less than 7% of electricity came from renewables in 2010. It was about half when we left office. It's transformed, and the lights stayed on. But there are issues about making sure that we do it in a way that keeps the costs down, and that we can lower costs over time so we are competitive.
Thank you. And one more quick question for you, Nick, because I know you've spent the last few weeks doing lots of polling and finding out people's opinion on this issue. This is a very divisive issue. There's no running away from that. And there will be people in this room today who are very much opposed to net zero for a range of reasons, perhaps don't even believe that climate change is happening. From the polling you've done, what are the biggest concerns people have? What are the biggest reasons that they might oppose net zero as a target or not actually believe it's necessary at all?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Ultimately, you have to look at different voter groups, but on the whole, I always come back to the practical and the direct impact on consumers, right? So when we went to Teesside and we spoke to people who know loads and are really excited about the fact that there's loads of wind farm production in their local area, and think it's extremely exciting and reflects very well on the mayor, they're still pretty worried that the targets that, when you put it to them 2030, they're concerned that they aren't necessarily realistic or pragmatic, or they're going to require too much upheaval to get done. And so I think either making sure that that is really, really clearly messaged out and in how that's going to be achieved is really, really important for those of us who want to get it done. And as I say, the second is this sort of direct impact. I think anyone who's read The Telegraph in the last 2 years will have read a story about heat pumps or about electric cars and the panic that it causes some people. And we have to listen to that. Ultimately, when things become potential things on your balance sheet at the end of the month and feel like they're going to be more expensive versions of the things that you're already doing, that's where people are concerned. So again, proving and showing to them how beneficial things can be, the benefits that can bring them, and also potentially setting things out in order that they can be sufficiently incentivized to make those switches is probably the way that I would think about it. But those are the key concerns. There are some people who are extremely ideologically opposed to it, but that's quite a small group, and ultimately that's not a group that I think is going to win the election for anyone.
Okay, thank you. We can go to questions now. So, yep, Emma's got the mic. We'll start with this gentleman down here because I saw him shaking his head quite vehemently at something our panellists said.
Yeah, when the electorate wake up to the fact that net zero neither reduces emissions and tackles climate change, nor burns carbon and makes people rich and lowers their bills, when they've realised that it's a way of rich countries not doing anything just tick box exercises and paying off companies in India or Zimbabwe or whatever not to produce. It doesn't tackle anything. So when they realise that, when the voters wake up to the fact it doesn't do anything, it's meaningless, I think it'll be a liability if Conservatives put that forward. So it's neither fish nor fowl, in my opinion.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of more questions and then we'll do them in threes. The lady standing up with a purple jacket, and then we'll take somebody from that side of the room. The gentleman waving at me.
Clem Cowton, I'm Director of External Affairs at Octopus Energy Group and a member of RenewableUK. I wondered what the panel whether the panel believes that there is a potential liability to the net zero cause from the constraint payments that we're currently paying to onshore wind in particular, and in Scotland, that are likely to rise to £4 billion by the end of the decade per year going on consumer bills. Just bearing in mind that that's available, generated renewable energy that could be given to customers for free, and is instead being subsidised to switch off.
Wave again, please. I'm giving Emma a workout in the process.
Hi, I'm from South Northamptonshire, where we have a Conservative MP, and largely because of her opposition to a ground-mounted 500 megawatt solar farm on productive agricultural land. Given that worldwide emissions are still increasing, should we not be prioritising being able to protect ourselves from the effect of climate change, such as food security, over covering our agricultural land with solar panels?
Great, thank you. Selaine, let's start with you.
As a former rural MP myself, I'm going to start on solar panels because I think the rurality issues really do define different parts of the country, and that we've spoken a lot about the reform vote, but obviously those of us that were Lib Dem facing, you know, we were Cameron's Conservatives, we voted blue to go green, and about the only thing my Lib Dem successor has done since being elected is sign up to the Lib Dem Climate and Nature Bill. So I'm all for farmers planting food and tackling food security. I think some of the, and it's again one of those perverse strategies that we cannot continue to just put solar onto productive food land, and we have energy security as well as food security, and we do need to balance the two, and we spoke in the last panel in here on land use frameworks and what's going to come through on that. And I think, you know, as an island we don't have enough room to do everything, and there are decisions that do need to be taken around our food security and our farming sector, and some of the other things that actually your farmers can deliver for you with regards to biodiversity net gain, with regards to carbon capture, and some of the other sides of net zero that we don't always talk about, the positive environmental benefits that are coming out of some of these strategies. But I do think it's the framing around it. But I agree, I'm quite not terribly keen on more solar panels on farmland. Put them on rooftops if we've got to have them.
Lord McInnes.
I think the important point the gentleman spoke about waking up is that in many, over the sort of generic issue of climate and net zero, at the moment the electorate has not woken up as you would wish them to do. So at the moment people are positive about climate action and moving towards net zero. So that is the political climate which we as a party are in. The issues are, as we've heard from the gentleman, and the constraint payments as well, about the individual issues that then make people think twice. And I think going to Nick's point about tangibility, one of the big issues we hear about heat pumps when we do focus groups is people are concerned about who's going to fix my heat pump when it goes wrong, because people are worried about the infrastructure and the industrial infrastructure. And I think it's incumbent upon the renewable sector always to provide that narrative of what's positive and what's going to make the difference, because people are very concerned inevitably about change, and while they can be committed to an outcome from that change, they are very concerned that this is the support necessary for that change isn't going to happen. So I think it's very important as well that we recognise it's almost like there is a brand issue about climate, as Nick has said, that is attractive to voters and makes this party look forward-looking. And that is very important if we are to regain trust and build a coalition. But at the same time, in South Northamptonshire, people are very concerned about the practical application of the industrial policy. And so that balance has to be about always working on the narrative and remembering often that especially a lot of climate NGOs are way out of connection with the electors who are even warm about climate action but are worried about what's going to happen. And bridging that gap is actually an important job for the Conservative Party.
Dan, can I go to you? And in particular, I wondered if you could explain what curtailment is. I don't think it's a concept most ordinary people are familiar with, and then what curtailment costs are.
So constraint payments are, or curtailments as it's called in some other parts of the energy market, is where a renewable generator needs to switch off because there's insufficient grid capacity. In other words, the grid can't take the renewable energy. And therefore the renewable generator is paid to switch off. Nobody in the sector, and certainly no one I represent when I talk to them, because this is one of the things that people pick the phone up to us about the most, nobody wants to receive a constraint payment. Actually, most generators want to be paid for the electricity that they're capable of generating. And this is no, let's say, ideal scenario for anyone. And the thing that sits behind it is that for regulatory reasons, for many, many years, the national grid has not been invested in ahead of need. So basically, we've said that we invest to catch up with demand, and as a result, there are parts of the country which need significant amounts of investment in the transmission network. And this is sort of points to that sort of fragile consensus with people at the moment regarding, you know, building new infrastructure and the potential impact of that infrastructure. So to Clem's question, you know, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Yes, it's a potential risk that, you know, if it was seen that nobody took any action on this subject, and actually the right solution is to take action on it. Sounds interesting. So you know, what we're calling for is to make sure that the grid investments, and I know Graham as Networks Minister worked incredibly hard on this, to make sure that those investments happen, they happen in a timely fashion, and they happen with communities taken with them, because ultimately that liability could move from being a liability on constraint payments to a liability on running roughshod over communities if we don't get that right. So our plea as a sector is, let's build network, and let's build network considerately and do it, you know, with communities.
Thank you. In terms of solar, I think if all the 70 gigawatts we have as a target for solar by 2035 was built, it would take up less than 1% of UK farming land. Just to put that in perspective, that doesn't, when you have a cumulative impact in an area, in my own constituency, there's a lot of things, a lot of applications, people can feel a little overwhelmed and frightened about what it can mean. So I think that's got to be listened to, and and it's always got to be managed. But the whole of the country is not going to be covered in solar farms, even as we deliver the vast amount of renewable power that we need. And solar, ground mount, people say, well, why don't you put it on the roofs? Well, you just have to think about it for 5 minutes. The roof is small, discreet, you've got to send in a surveyor. The costs are just enormously higher, whereas you ground mount up on an industrial scale, it is a bit industrial admittedly, and you put it up, it's cheap. And one of the things we've got to do as we go to renewables is make sure it's cheap. And that links then into the other issue around getting the wiring right as well. And there's a certain amount of offshore, undergrounding in some areas, but fundamentally offshore and underground is a lot more expensive. And if one of your aims of, and this is when I was the energy minister, was very focused on, is we have the opportunity by leading the world, and this is trying to bring the skeptics, Vijay and others on board, is if accepting that the world has signed up to this at the international conferences, which I was last one, I was the lead negotiator for the UK, they have signed up to it. The world not following as fast as us, but is following. In that world, we've actually wired up, taken the vast renewable potential of the UK. We've put in the connections that are required. We had it in the past. That's what all the pylons of the past were. To be a modern, rich Western economy, you have to put that wiring in place. We're rewiring the country again for a different type of energy. We've got to do it, but do it in a way that listens to people, but not end up with HS2 times every bit of transmission infrastructure. We've got to get on with it, get that balance right somehow, and move at speed. When we do, we can have low-cost domestic energy. We're no longer dependent. When the Straits of Hormuz are getting bombed by the Houthis or anyone else, we're not having to worry about it anymore. We should be patriotic about the fact that we harness it here, we do it in a way that's cheap, and as the rest of Europe and the rest of the world follows us, we come out having taken our remarkable geography, shoreline and the rest of it, and convert it into being this amazing green powerhouse and linking into the North Sea with our neighbours, which we also worked on as well. So there's an exciting future there. We've got to make sure it's not just rhetoric, though. We've got to make sure for sceptics like VJ and others that we can show the numbers add up, that we're not sacrificing there today for some green promise tomorrow, but we actually do it in a practical and pragmatic way. But that's what we're trying to get to, wiring that all together and having a public conversation which we take people with us and they live with the realities while dealing with difficult things like the transfer of heat. When I had the net zero responsibility, my sort of flashing lights were probably around heat because of the heat pumps and getting them out there. And I know Octopus, Clem talked about that, getting that in place, getting constraints on the constraint payment, build the infrastructure, the grids, but also have an energy market which is fit for purpose, which I'm sure Clem was getting at, because I was responsible for REMA, the review of electricity market arrangements. Do we have a nodal pricing for every little corner of the country? Do we have zonal, so that there are price signals? Because again, you imagine if you cannot build or can't build quickly enough all the transmission infrastructure you need when you have excess energy, if there was a price signal that it was cheap there, then you could have a new data centre set up on the basis that it can do that. And that £4 billion is not spent on taking energy and just throwing it away. It's actually converted into a data center, maybe a hydrogen production plant, maybe some traditional or non-traditional steel or other manufacturing process. So getting the system right is phenomenally complicated, and I know Octopus has very strong views on that. But trying to get all those things right, we can move to a green and prosperous future, remembering that everyone else has signed up to this, as they did. They said they were going to phase out fossil fuels. They're following. The rest of Europe are signed up to it. And we so far are pretty much, well, I think, according to the UNFCCC, about the only country in the world that's actually on track to do what it says. But the others are coming. And we've got to show to people that we're doing it in a pragmatic way that's going to make them richer and their children and grandchildren richer and more prosperous too. And if we don't get that right, then we will lose people. But if we can get it right, then we can bring the skeptics on board, because we say, well, it's a no-brainer, it's cheap, it's domestic, and it's going to give us an advantage, especially as things like CBAMs, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, basically a carbon tax at the border, come in as well. That's the kind of future that Europe set out. Others will follow. That's the kind of, it's all these pieces that we're trying to get right, and I accept there are many question marks about our ability to deliver it. But if we get it right, then we can come out. I want to see us in the 2030s a richer, more prosperous nation, that it can also be insufferably smug about the fact that it did the right thing but got rich doing it. Get that combination, and VJs will come round, because they'll go, well, actually, yeah, you've actually done it. But that's what we need to do.
Dan, did you want to make a quick
I just
point?
go on, yeah. I just wanted to trot out a soundbite that we use on the solar point, which is, I know to my colleagues from Solar Energy UK in the room, is that if we built every single solar farm we need, the 70 gigawatts, then we would use less land than we currently commit in this country to golf courses. So, question about where our priorities lie.
Thank you. I'll take 3 more questions. Can I ask that you make them incredibly brief, and also remember the theme of the discussion is whether it's an electoral asset. I know people have various points they want to make. The gentleman by the door over there, and then afterwards we'll take this lady with the glasses on her head. And you, sir, there.
Right, I'm John Davis, CPF from Huntingdonshire. The issue is opportunity and pragmatism. The opportunity is there. The pragmatic issue is very important. I'll go for 2 things. Aviation, you are not going to run aircraft on AAAs. So we're looking at liquid fuels for that. There's also, coming back to pragmatism, look what was talked about Tyneside. We've got a lot of people who are worried about having to go to electric vehicles. There is still a huge market for the internal combustion engine. There are fuels out there. There is a big market for this. So electricity and the hydrogen you're talking about, great. I want to know what the panel's drive is on pushing the development of liquid fuels for aviation and continued internal combustion.
Thank you, Emma. Just this gentleman here in the front, and then we'll go.
Yeah, I just found this discussion quite interesting because several of you said that renewables, net zero, didn't really feature in the election, or the failure of the Conservatives. What happens if one of the new leaders comes along and says, look, there's this policy that is going to make a difference. So, I'm going to produce lots of wonderful jobs, and I'm going to do this. And to be able to do that, it requires some slight flex or give on net zero. My view is the vote winner is to say that the policy that will make a difference, which is not net zero, that comes first, and net zero comes second. So that's the way I think we should spin this.
And the lady over there with the glasses on her head. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Richardson. I'm Deputy Chair of Ashford. Given the electorate's concern about, there are issues around grid capacity and also electorate's concern about what the infrastructure is going to cost and take in terms. Why do you think politicians have been reluctant to talk more about heat networks or decentralised energy solutions, which could obviously provide an interim solution to both those problems?
Thank you. Selaine, let's start with you.
With regards to aviation and liquid fuels, I think, again, it depends where your liquid fuels are coming from, because if we're into biofuel territory, we've then just got a different land use pressure onto a land that's already oversubscribed with many other uses. But that would be my concern over aviation. But I think, again, when you, as rural and remote as we are, one of the concerns of our constituents is we never get on an aeroplane anyway. I'm 4.5 hours from Heathrow Airport. And so I think some of the usage, people talk a lot about having to keep flying, but there are communities that very rarely get on a plane. With the second net zero coming second in policy terms, I think while it's in the conversation, which actually is the important thing, that it is a recognition that we are part of a global community that does need to tackle this. And on the heat networks point, I've actually, while I was MT, met with some really interesting people from Global City Futures and their work that they are actually doing on heat networks and heat exchange systems. And I think, again, some of those things are very city-centric. And I think that, what we really need to, and where a lot of the pushback on some of these policies has come, is that differentiation between our rural communities and our city communities. And I do think for us electorally that we have a real opportunity to actually focus on our rural voters, because it's perfectly clear this government really doesn't give a flying monkeys about them. And so, if we could actually, I think there is if we're looking for some electoral strategies, really looking at how we can deal with rurality and understand that city is different. And I think there's some really exciting things on heat networks. But again, there is a sector of this, our community is excluded, and most of them are actually natural Conservative voters. They'd be a good place to start to get our vote back.
Thank you, Selaine. Lord McInnes.
Mark, please. I think, going to the gentleman's point about, in effect, a Trojan horse idea of producing outcomes that actually complement net zero policy, I think is absolutely correct. And I think that, to a good degree, is what's happened in Teesside, in that people have been able to see good, tangible, high-quality jobs coming to their area that happen to coincide with a net zero policy. And I think that is, if you like, the golden ticket that everyone should look.
I was going one step further,
yes.
Saying you may have to actually slightly delay net zero policies to get those policies.
So I think you mentioned flex, and hopefully that is where the electorate is. They're pragmatic. They want the economy. They will support net zero if they see good outcomes for the economy, as well as the general altruism of it and the importance of it. So you've got buy-in, but there's another group of people, I think you're absolutely right, who are probably slightly sceptical and are more interested in tangible goods that will come from it. And we shouldn't shy away from that as Conservatives. I think the danger for us is that we either become too ideologically driven either way about net zero, and that completely dominates what we're saying, because then we lose that connection with people. So the two things are always very important, I think.
Thank you. And Nick?
Yeah, I think just sort of picking up on something that Graham and Selaine mentioned, this conflict perhaps between the aims of the centre to do with grid capacity, with pylons, and with individual communities. ultimately, I think that there's clearly a big problem in the UK with the number of veto players that we have, that just drives up the cost of, frankly, any kind of infrastructure project, whether it's housing or energy, and makes things like our transition to renewable energy much more expensive. I don't know if any of you read the SA Foundations that has been doing the rounds, but it's a very powerful account of that. And so I think solving that is an extremely important point. And moving to purely allowing communities to veto any kind of infrastructure is perhaps not a really sustainable position for the Conservatives. But there is clearly, in talking about electoral strategy and positioning as regards the Labour Party's policies, there's a differentiation point of saying, how can the Conservatives say yes but or yes and to Labour's policies, where ultimately the aims are pretty widely agreed upon. So we need to move away from hydrocarbons, renewables are the route forward. As I say, this has pretty broad buy-in, but how the Conservatives can tread a path between this problem with an inability to do things cheaply, HS2 was mentioned, and the opportunity perhaps to lean on communities and community opposition is going to be a difficult one. And I think that there's a very easy way to see the Conservatives going down the wrong path on it.
Thank you. I'm not going to take any more questions because it's nearly the end, but I am going to pose one final question to all panellists for their closing remarks. Thinking ahead to the next general election, if you can bear it, when the Conservatives are putting forward their next manifesto, what do you think they will have in that manifesto, and what should they have in that manifesto? Let's start with you, Dan.
Well, that's unfair coming to me first. I'd say, and it links a little bit to the question before, is to look at what the corporate world is doing, right? The corporate world is investing in aviation sector, is spending money on sustainable aviation fuels. In the automotive industry, it spent 1% of its global combined R&D budget last year on internal combustion. It spent it on electrification and on digitalisation. So the world is moving. The world is moving in this direction. And so it becomes a question of, do you want to capture the value? Do you want to position the UK economy against growing markets, accelerated growth markets? Do we want to be the engine of that growth in Europe and in the West? And I would hope, as a political party which has always believed in the free market and always believed in aspiration and entrepreneurship, that the Conservative Party manifesto in 2029 would look to how to harbour the entrepreneurship and innovation of the United Kingdom to capture that value, because that value is going to end up somewhere, and it might as well be here.
Thank you, and you yourself, Graham.
Well, I think I agree with Dan. Easy. No, we'll see. We'll hit the circumstances when we get there. But bringing together this, as everyone has touched on, this ambition coupled with pragmatism, we need to convert those into election pledges. Going back to the gentleman's remark about the conflict between a policy that might be a vote winner and net zero, because net zero is the law. We put it in the law in 2019, so we could come in, but you would have to build a you would have to go in on the basis that you were going to be able to revoke the Climate Change Act. Now that might be your bid for the 2029 manifesto. I don't think we're going to be in that position, at which point, so again, before everyone just thinks it's just free thinking, you're right, sir, to identify, abolish, revoke that act. I don't think there'll be ambition for that. So we'll be within that act, at which point our choices and options, and we should be, as Dan suggested, showing that the market-based approach, because we've got Great British Energy, which is this 8.3 billion, sounds like a lot. It has no purpose. I mean, there was no shortage of investment in renewables. And they've said it's going to do everything. They said it's going to do nuclear. We've already got Great British Nuclear. I mean, they are intellectually incoherent. And apparently this area is their most advanced in the policy space, which is a bit frightening. So I think there'll be a target-rich environment for us to be able to go in, hopefully, whoever's leader, to say, yes, we accept, the nation has spoken, we're going to carry on going with net zero, unless there's something is meant that we have to revoke it. After the Scottish nationalists said that they were going to have climate targets they set in law for 2030, and of course It just got to the point where they couldn't deliver it. So we'll have to look at the situation at the time. But I think there will be the ambition for us to do it. We need to show that with the market-based policies, rational decision-making, an open and honest approach, we're the party to take it forward. And we will be able to point back and say, you didn't know it at the time, but guess who was the party, the ones who actually drove this before we got into the eras of Labour? And that's the Conservatives. And I think we could have a whole series of things. We'll look at the technologies and the various policy options. We'll be able to put forward a very positive message built on our past record with a forward look that hopefully makes people like VJ go, yeah, okay, reluctantly, I can live with this, because there seem to be more and more green jobs in my area, and I'm actually seeing people coming into this country because they can see a future where we, in a world of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, we've actually created the world's first net zero industrial clusters, etc. The inward investment that could come from things like that is enormous, not least in places like around Humber and Teesside. And again, in terms of a political vision, we're taking the high carbon areas of the UK that have fallen on hard times, left behind areas, the ones we wanted to level up. Those are the very areas that are most likely to be able to harness and host the green technology. So you bring together moral justice for the nation, levelling up, prosperity and delivery on the climate front. As I say, if we get it right, it'll be very Boris Johnsonian in its outcome. We get to have our cake and eat it if we get it right.
Thank you. Selaine.
I hope when we get to the next manifesto we manage to actually communicate the message more effectively than last time, and that the policies are decipherable by the general population, because actually if you look at the Liberal Democrats who've taken my seat, they don't have any policies, and a single emoji has summarised their entire water strategy, and that has been enough for them to take 72 seats. And if we want to take those seats back, we really do need to look at our communication strategy, because whilst we might have done brilliant things, the only reason we know what we know about water quality is because of what we've done. Yet still, everyone believes that I filled my bathing water beaches up with poo. And I am sick to death. But, you know, that is a comms catastrophe of our creating. And when we get to the next manifesto, we have to find a way of communicating more effectively what we have done in a way that people actually want to listen and reflects the social media age that we live in.
Mark.
Thank you very much.
I did call you Mark this time.
Yeah, great. I'm a great believer in political cakeism, so I'm right behind Graham on that. I think fundamentally our challenge at the next election will be to recognise that political gravity will still allow a consensus to be there about net zero, but what the challenge to us as a party will be to demonstrate tangible ways we're going to deliver that, because I think another way that we failed was people wondered what a Conservative government was actually for. And unless our pledges at the next general election are tangible to people, deal with the green industrialisation that's required, then people won't believe us, and it actually damages the entire net zero programme if that happens.
And finally, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, to echo Mark slightly, one of the things that we asked about in our poll was, you know, why didn't you vote for the Conservatives this time? And what came through really strongly was issues of trust, issues of delivery. Net zero is a pretty heady goal. Certainly it requires a lot of change, a lot of investment, and a lot of political decisions. It's very difficult to see the voters giving the trust to a party that has been seen by them to not deliver on the things that are most important to them, like immigration. But I think we've spoken about the market for energy. The market for votes, I think, is going to mean that the two questions of what will they have and what should they have kind of look the same, at least to me. There's this really, ultimately, for the voters for whom there likely to be, you know, some scepticism or some deep-seated opposition, it's going to be so far down the list of issues that it's not going to be an important part of any offer to the market for votes. But for some voters, for voters in Conservative Lib Dem constituencies, for lots of voters across the country, it's going to be an important part of showing that the Conservatives understand the issues of the time. And having a plausible plan to do that is, to my view, going to be really, really important. And so I expect it to be part of the next manifesto.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all the panellists, and a big thank you as well to our sponsor, Renewable UK. Before you give a round of applause to the panel, I'd just like to let you know that our next event is in half an hour, and its title is What Does the Future of Conservative Environmentalism Look Like? And it's going to have Michael Gove on the panel, so that should be an interesting one. That's at 3 o'clock. And with that, please give a round of applause to the panel.